Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Right here is the first printing of Poe's first detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And over here, the first printing of Poe's classic terror tale, The Telltale Heart. But I'm sure you've already read both of those. So tonight, I'm going to show you one of Poe's early short stories, one you probably never even heard of. And we have the manuscript for it right here. And that will be the subject of tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. So here it is. This is the only surviving manuscript for Poe's early short story, Ciope, or Fable. It's written on a tiny piece of paper, roughly half the size of a sheet of printer paper. And you can tell on the side here, it's sort of been trimmed unevenly, like it was cut out of a notebook. Because it was cut out of a notebook. This isn't Poe's notebook, but this is the kind of notebook that he would have had, that he was compiling his early short stories in. By this time, Poe's early 20s, he's dropped out of the University of Virginia. He's been in the military for 2 years. He attended the United States Military Academy at West Point until he was expelled. And in the meantime, he wrote 3 books of poetry. And none of them was a commercial success. So the year he published his 3rd book of poetry and got kicked out of West Point, he moved to Baltimore with his grandmother, his aunt, his cousins, and his brother Henry. And we don't know exactly how he was surviving in those years in Baltimore. There's theories he might have even been a bricklayer. But while he was there, something important happened. He realized the big market for his work wasn't necessarily going to be books. It was going to be magazines and newspapers. He still had his heart set on becoming a great poet. But the magazines wanted short stories, and they were having short story contests. So he started writing short stories and compiling them in a big book of short stories for an anthology. See, the end goal wasn't just to publish things in magazines. Sure, that was an easy way to make some quick money by winning some short story contests, or maybe by getting your work placed in major papers. But his end goal was to get another book published. After all, newspapers were ephemeral. You read them, you throw them in the trash, you maybe line your birdcage with them. Poe wanted his work to be in books that were in libraries, that were in great collections. So he knew the way to do that was to make an anthology of short stories. So from the very beginning, he had this plan in mind. His book was going to be called Tales of the Folio Club. And the idea was that each of the stories in the book is told by a different member of a literary club. And between each of the stories, the members of the club make witty banter and criticize the stories. So to that end, by 1833, he was 24 years old. He sent his idea to a publisher, which turned it down. And he probably heard the thing he was going to hear a few times. Nobody wants a book of short stories. They want one long connected work like a novel. People want novels. So Poe cut the stories out of his notebook and sent them to different contests and actually got some of them published. He sent a few of his short stories to a literary contest being published up in Philadelphia. He didn't win, but the newspaper still printed all of his stories without paying it. He sent some more of his stories to a contest being held in Baltimore by the Baltimore Saturday Visitor. He actually won that one for an adventure story called Manuscript Found in a Bottle. So his works were getting published. except for this one. Maybe CFP was just too weird. So just a few years later, he sent it to one of those annual gift books called The Gift. It comes out each year around Christmas time, so you can buy it as a Christmas or New Year's gift. There's a bunch of short stories in it from celebrated authors. And The Gift turned it down. And Poe wrote a letter about the time, said he couldn't understand why they had turned it down. This CFP, it's a great story. He was surprised that instead of printing this, they just reprinted his old story, Manuscript Found in a Bottle. So then it was 6 years after he wrote it, he finally got it published in a different gift book called The Baltimore Book. You'll never guess where it's published. But they published it, and it actually started to get some attention. It's never going to be his best-known story. It's too weird, too experimental, but I think it's a very interesting one. Its full title is Ciope, a Fable. And Ciope is derived from the Greek word Ciope, which means to hush or to silence. And some critics have also speculated that if you scramble up the names for Ciope, it spells out is Poe or Poe is. So the full title would be Ciope, a Fable, or Is Poe a Fable? Or Poe is a Fable. I'm not fully buying that theory. But anyway, the story's set up within a framework. The framework story has an unnamed man, for some reason, hanging out outside an ancient tomb. When a demon comes out of the tomb and puts his hand on his head and says, let me tell you a story. And if a demon comes out of a tomb and puts his hand on your head and says, let me tell you a story, you'll listen to that story. So his story is about this jungle in Africa, and the demon is there, and he sees a man in ancient robes who goes on top of a giant rock, and on the side of this rock is carved the word desolation. And there's chaos and loud noises and rain that's pouring, turning into blood all around him. So chaos and desolation all around him, but the man just sits there looking at everything. So the demon decides, I'm going to get this guy. So he decides to torment him by having all the hippos run up to the edge of the rock and roar at him. And the man just sits there, doesn't seem to notice, doesn't seem to care. So then the demon has thunder and lightning lashing across this rock. Even the lilies, the giant water lilies, are shrieking in terror, but the man just sits there. And then the demon says, I've got it. And he makes everything fall completely silent. Even the word carved into the side of the rock has now changed from desolation to silence. And at that, the man just runs away in terror. So back to the framework story, the demon's telling the story, and he starts laughing, a maniacal laugh. And the man he's telling the story can't laugh with him. So the demon curses him and sinks back into his tomb. So that's Poe's fable. So what's the moral of the fable? I think that it's that humans can bear all sorts of terrors. And there's a lot of terrors you'll probably never face. You might never be attacked by a bunch of hippos, or by rain that turns into blood, or by shrieking water lilies. But there's one ultimate terror that we won't escape. The final silence of the tomb. And that is more horrifying than any of those other imagined terrors. So not the most cheerful ending to your fable, and not something you see in one of Aesop's fables. But I think Poe's readers caught on to this in a contemporary review of the Baltimore book. The critic said, this fable, if we reck it right, is intended to indicate the horror of silence, that man may not be entirely accursed while he can hear the sounds which hurtle in the bosom of nature. The curse of tumult is represented as happiness to the curse of silence. The strain is wild, the language beautiful, and peculiar to Mr. Poe. So I think the critic got it. But the general public maybe didn't quite get Ciope. But I think another one of his critics was onto something. A couple years after this story is published in the Baltimore book, Poe finally got a collection of his short stories published. It's called The Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. He'd have throughout the whole framework thing, throughout the whole Tales of the Folio Club aspect, and just have a straight collection of short stories. And a critic for the Southern Literary Messenger singled out Manuscript Found in a Bottle and Ciope as good specimens of the author's stronger and more graphic powers. What does he mean by graphic powers? I do think he's onto something here. I believe he's talking about the visual aspect. There's not a lot of story to Ciope. It's just a guy sitting on a rock being tormented by a demon. But it's very visual. Imagine the screaming flowers and the rain turning to blood. This is a feast for the eyes. There's all sorts of visual sensations. So this reminds me a little bit of Poe's definition of poetry. Early on, he said that the difference between poetry and prose, like fiction for instance, is that poetry is concerned with indefinite sensations, whereas prose is concerned with definite, concrete sensations. So here's Poe right at the beginning of his career. This is the first couple years of him actually writing short stories, and he's trying to have it both ways. This is a guy who published 3 books of poetry before he ever published his first short story. He really wanted to be a poet. He wanted to be known as a poet. So here he is writing something that's halfway between prose and poetry. In fact, I would even think of it as a prose poem. And that's an art form that later poets would, like Charles Baudelaire, the great French poet and an admirer of Poe's, would pick up on. And they'd follow that train of reasoning. That here really is Poe with one foot in both worlds as a poet and a prose writer. And that's why this story is so unique in his oeuvre. There's not much of a narrative here, but it does create a lasting impression on you if you really read it. And you should read it. You can tell right here, it's not a very long story. You can probably just read it in 10 minutes. And Poe finally did change the name to Silence of Fable 6 years later when he published it in the Broadway Journal, a magazine he was editing up in New York. And that's the title that you'll find it under today. But let's take a closer look at this manuscript. Well, I mentioned it's a small piece of paper. It's cut off on one edge here, whereas taken out of the notebook. And you'll see right here, there's little notations made by the typesetter when it was printed. So this manuscript was sent to the Baltimore book, and they typeset it from this. And a lot of Poe's manuscripts went to magazines and newspapers, but a lot of authors' manuscripts ended up in newspapers and magazines. So the magazines saw a lot of paper, big piles, mountains of paper, and most of them they threw out. Why on earth would you save this poem or this short story from this unknown author? As long as you have it in print, you've got a copy. You don't need the original manuscript anymore. So why didn't this get destroyed? Why didn't this end up in the trash, where so many of Poe's other works did? There's no surviving manuscript for The Telltale Heart, probably Poe's best known short story. It probably ended up in a trash bin somewhere. Well, according to the editor N.C. Brooks, one of Poe's friends, he saw this manuscript in the wastepaper basket and rescued it, and apparently sent it back to Poe. Then when Poe died, his literary executor Rufus Griswold gathered up all of Poe's manuscripts that are still available, including this one, to help him compile the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe. And it stayed in Griswold's family until his grandson donated it to the Poe Museum. It's one of just 2 surviving pages of that original notebook. The other piece is the introduction, the very first page. This is page 71, the last page. So why don't you read Poe's early short story Silence, and let us know down in the comments what you think. And if you'd like to help preserve precious Poe pieces like this, why not contribute to the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. So thanks for joining us, and until next time, I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing cat stuff.